Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking something huge, literally. It's one of the most intensely debated pieces of legislation moving through New Zealand's parliament right now. Aotearoa, New Zealand has this truly massive conservation estate, and it's a huge point of national pride. But the proposed Conservation Amendment Bill, well, it aims to fundamentally change how all that land is managed. Because this is such an emotionally and politically charged topic, we're going to keep things completely impartial today. We're just looking strictly at the facts, the data, and the direct arguments from the sources to figure out what's really at stake here.
So, to get a real 360-degree view, we've broken this down into 6 parts. The bill itself, the economic argument, the environmental pushback, indigenous dispossession, real-world impacts, and finally, what happens next. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The Conservation Amendment Bill, setting the stakes.
Now, if you've been scrolling the news lately, you've probably seen headlines asking this exact question. Could billionaires soon buy up New Zealand's national estate? It's quite the hook, right? I mean, the idea of foreign billionaires swooping in to buy pristine public land sounds exactly like a movie plot. But that question actually represents the central conflict of this entire debate. To separate the movie plots from reality, though, we really need to look at the numbers.
To ground this, you've got to understand the sheer scale we're talking about. 8.5 million hectares. To put that into perspective, that's roughly the size of Austria. Locally, it's about a third of Aotearoa, New Zealand's entire landmass. Now, it is absolutely vital to note that under this bill, 40% of that land, things like national parks, marine reserves, ecological sanctuaries, that remains tightly protected and completely exempt from sale. It's the remaining land that's causing all the friction.
Section 2. The Economic Argument, the government's pitch. Let's hear the rationale straight from Conservation Minister Tama Potaka.
The government's main argument is that the Department of Conservation, or DOC, is stuck operating under totally outdated legislation. Minister Potaka actually describes this as the biggest change to conservation management in decades. The big shift here? DOC gets a brand new mandate to put economic opportunities front and center. Basically, they want to cut the red tape. They're looking to introduce pre-approved activities so that 30 to 40% of commercial applications, think guided biking or horse trekking, don't even need individual processing. Plus, it enables the collection of levies from international tourists. And that brings us to the financial bottom line. Minister Potaka expects these modernizations to raise an estimated $60 million every single year. And the promise here is that this revenue isn't just going to disappear into general government coffers. It is specifically earmarked to be reinvested straight back into the conservation estate. We're talking funding for tracks, huts, heritage sites, and crucial biodiversity protection, all while supposedly maintaining free access for regular New Zealanders.
But what about the massive land sell-offs people are worried about? Well, Minister Potaka pushes back hard on that narrative. During a parliamentary scrutiny hearing, he defended the bill, actually saying the idea he's trying to sell 60% of the conservation estate is spurious, ridiculous, fantasy land. He even called it the Olympic Championships for exaggeration. He insists DOC isn't embarking on some massive sell-off program and that only little bits and bobs, like a tiny parcel of land sitting under a Wellington weather station, would ever actually be sold.
Section 3. The environmental pushback, the conservationist view. Okay, so here's the figure that has conservation groups absolutely sounding the alarm: 5.1 million hectares. Even though the bill explicitly protects 40% of the estate, it also proposes expanding the types of land legally eligible to be sold, and that brings the total potential pool to just over 5 million hectares. Let's visualize that jump. Currently, only land classed as stewardship land is allowed to be sold, which is about 2.4 million hectares. The proposed bill would more than double that pool by throwing in another 2.8 million hectares, including conservation parks and forest parks. Now, the government is quick to point out that eligible does not mean sold, but conservationists argue that just creating the legal framework to allow it in the first place is a massive, dangerous shift.
So what's actually changing? It comes down to the rules for selling the land. Right now, stewardship land can only be sold if it has no or very low conservation value. It's a pretty high bar. But the proposed bill changes that test. Under the new rules, land could potentially be sold as long as it's not important for threatened species and doesn't contain the best examples of wildlife or plants in the area. Richard Cappy, the chief advisor on conservation policy for Forest and Bird, argues this new safeguard sets a deeply concerning, much lower threshold that puts native species squarely at risk.
When you look at a map of this newly eligible land, the geographic scale is honestly staggering. Vast areas across the country represent this newly opened doorway for economic opportunities, exchange, or disposal under the bill. Now, to be fair, Minister Potaka completely disputes this interpretation as misleading, reiterating again that eligible doesn't mean sold. But for environmentalists, that map is the literal legal doorway swinging wide open.
Which circles us right back to our opening question. Richard Capey warns this bill isn't just about DOC managing its own backyard. It opens the door for third parties to literally knock on DOC's door with purchase offers. Think about it. If a theoretical billionaire wants to buy land that falls just barely short of that new lower threshold for threatened species, and DOC now has a legal mandate to be an economic agency and maximize revenue, well, KP suggests the outcome is going to be heavily tipped in favor of the billionaires.
Section 4. Dispossession by briefcase. The indigenous perspective.
Now, this highly charged quote comes from an opinion piece by Ivor Jones in the Māori Green Lantern. And for a bit of context, the Māori Green Lantern is a publication fighting misinformation and disinformation from the far right, very easily recognizable by its striking red, white, green, and black design colors. We're including this to impartially reflect the really intense feeling of betrayal happening within some Indigenous communities right now. Jones frames these proposed changes not as modern conservation at all, but as a direct continuation of historical land loss, only this time facilitated by a Māori minister.
To really grasp the weight behind that anger, we have to look back at the historical context. The Waitangi Tribunal's landmark Y-262 claim fundamentally stated that every inch of the conservation estate is tribal territory. You see, for Māori, this land isn't just some economic asset or an ecological zone, it's deeply ancestral. It is fundamentally intertwined with Waka Papa, that's genealogy, and spiritual identity. That makes this far, far more than a simple land dispute.
The core argument Jones presents is that this legislation operates as a modern dispossession by briefcase. By altering these legal frameworks and expanding the land eligible for sale, the fear is that over 5 million hectares of ancestral tribal territory is just being opened up to foreign capital and private development. And as a result, it effectively narrows the scope for any future treaty settlements.
Section 5. Real-world impacts. Focus on Marlborough.
Let's ground this national debate in a local reality. In Marlborough, huge swaths of land could be affected. We're talking about Molesworth Station, which is New Zealand's largest farm. We're looking at Ka Waitatu Ōrakihuia Conservation Park in the Kaikoura Ranges, the super popular Pelorus Bridge Scenic Reserve, and, incredibly importantly, the Wairau Bar, which holds immense archaeological significance as the recognized birthplace of Aotearoa. The mere idea that these specific, tangible places could face commercial development has sparked a really fierce local debate. On the ground, this explodes into two fiercely opposing views. On one hand, you have Marlborough Councillor Gerald Hope taking a very pragmatic stance. He argues that an underfunded dock has basically left a vast estate to just languish, and that carefully managed commercial activity could actually improve environmental outcomes. But on the other hand, the Marlborough Tramping Club is furious. They accuse Dock of acting like a real estate agent ready to hawk off the silverware just to make up for revenue shortfalls, and they're terrified of sacrificing public access in the process.
Section 6. What happens next?
Well, the legislative clock is definitely ticking. With public submissions now closed, the bill is sitting right under the microscope of a select committee for rigorous review and debate. They're the ones who have to weigh these economic pitches against all that environmental and Indigenous pushback. Following that, it'll face its second and third readings in Parliament before it can officially become the law of the land.
Which leaves us with this final overarching question. Because, as you can see, this isn't just a debate about policy anymore. It's a debate about identity. The government sees locked-up economic potential that could fund vital conservation work. Environmentalists see a lower threshold that could permanently fracture delicate ecosystems. And Indigenous voices see a legislative briefcase threatening their ancestral lands. So how does New Zealand balance the economic viability of Aotearoa's public lands with preserving its ecological and ancestral heritage? How they answer that will shape the physical and cultural landscape of the country for generations to come. Thanks for joining us for this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and we'll see you next time.